Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend Philip. Philip Chase, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, AP. It is fantastic to be back here on A Critical Dragon, where we have had some great discussions in the past, and I hope today will be another one.
Yeah, because today we're carrying on with our discussion of archetypes and symbols and tropes that we see in fantasy. And we just had a previous discussion on your channel about the Maiden, the Mother, and the Crone, this sort of all-encompassing female archetype that is pervasive throughout multiple forms of literature and culture and mythology and folklore. And we had sort of focused that discussion, once we'd introduced it, on the Crone, the sort of the elder female character. And now we're sort of turning our attention to the Maiden, the youngest of the characters. So I talked a lot in that last one. So please, Philip, you take this opportunity to let us have your thoughts.
Absolutely. So just to begin with some general remarks, what we often see in terms of the maiden, just as we discussed earlier with the whole Freudian concept of the mother figure coming in both a good, benevolent form and in an evil form. And there's a whole Freudian analysis behind that. But the virgin and the whore are seen as like dual aspects of the maiden as well. It comes in traditionally in these different incarnations throughout mythology and folk tales and so on and so forth. And a sort of variation of the whore being, I guess, the kind of the femme fatale. But you also have the virgin often appearing as a princess figure who is in need of rescue. And we're familiar with this concept from too many Disney films, at least some of the older ones, although to be fair to Disney, they have evolved somewhat, and you have newer incarnations of the princess who save themselves. So even Disney can change with the times. So absolutely. And so you have lots of different examples of this from, as I said, mythology to Disney and so on and so forth. But modern fantasy has lots of interesting examples of the maiden as well.
Yeah. So before we get into discussing the specific examples, there was a lot to unpack in what you just, threw out there. So like, one of the first things is the virgin whore dichotomy.
Right.
We see this wheeled out time and time again, far less often now than we used to, and that is something that is a change for the positive in writing. But again, we have to think back that a lot of earlier stories were very male centric in their focus. And because of that, the female characters, younger female characters, were often viewed in their relationship to the hero. Either they were a quest reward, the princess that they will rescue, that they will then marry as a traditional reward for completing the hero's quest and become king and have the beautiful wife, the kingdom, the magical object. You look at Campbell's hero's journey, that is one of the typical things. You look at Propp's morphology of the folk tale, that's one of the standard ways it sort of resolves. So in that aspect, because of the male-centric stories focus, young female characters were typically split into that virgin whore dichotomy, where the virginal was seen as pure, as perfect, as beautiful, as this object to be awarded to the hero, whereas the whore aspect was often used as the evil temptress, the seductress on the side of evil. And if you think, like, even going to He-Man, the cartoon from the 1980s, you had Tila as the sort of beautiful girl who Prince Adam was kind of pursuing, but then Evil Lynn, who wore the sexy outfit and clearly was having relationships with some people on Skeletor's crew. But she exuded sexuality, whereas Tila was much more prim and proper. And it was a way of this moral core, very conservative moral core of a lot of these stories. And that is something that is prevalent in a lot of Western literature, particularly that of the Anglophone spheres and North America, even in particular, a sort of puritanical streak. And the clearest example of this that we can kind of see in modern narratives is if you think back to the teen horror movie, like Friday the 13th and Halloween and all of these sorts of things. And it was parodied in the film Scream. And one of the rules was, if you want to survive one of these teen massacres, don't be having casual physical relationships with people. It's the virginal, the pure, who will remain alive at the end. Whereas if you're having sex with people, if you're sullied, if you're not in a permanent sanctified bond, then you're going to get killed. And we see that as this continuation of that very patriarchal, male-focused story, where it was the reward for the hero.
Right. And it boils down to the patriarchal control of female sexuality. I think that's what's at the root of a lot of these portrayals. But fortunately, we have seen that challenged, I think, very successfully, a lot of great narratives in modern times. Even, as I said, Disney. So you have, Disney princesses now who say, like Brave, for example, who save themselves, or Mulan, or whatever. We could talk about that, as opposed to the older versions like Cinderella and Snow White and so on. So who are
well, actually, I think one of the best sort of inversions of it all, one of the best ways of showing how times have changed, is if you think of the animated film Shrek, and in it the evil prince, the evil king character, voiced by, was it John Lithgow, has the mirror on the wall, and he asks for who are the three princesses. And the joke about Snow White is that she may live with 7 men, but that doesn't make her easy.
Oh dear.
And he's looking at these three, and obviously he chooses Princess Fiona, doesn't want to go on the quest, and sends Shrek. But during that, we see Princess Fiona, voiced by, was it Cameron Diaz?
I think so.
She kicks ass. She does her own thing, and it's not the cliche about a strong female character. It is a representation of a female character who is empowered, who has agency. That the story is not just about how they fit with the male storyline. They have their own story, and I think Shrek plays into that very, very neatly, even though it is adhering to all of those aspects of the traditional folklore and fairy tale. It still, spoiler alert for Shrek, it still ends up with them getting married and finding true love and being together. But it is very much a partnership of the two of them, a choice between the two of them. So that's what we're talking about in terms of that. The classic sort of seductress, the femme fatale, that is an element of detective noir that has been there since the inception of detective noir.
Right, absolutely. But in terms of fantasy, because we do focus on fantasy archetypes, there are so many examples, but let's start with a sort of a classic, I guess. Lord of the Rings, you have Éowyn, who is a form of the Maiden, who I think it's a bit of a mixed case. She does have her own sort of arc in there, although she ends up kind of pining for Aragorn and then eventually getting married off to Faramir, presumably when her warrior days are over. But she does do some important things before that happens, in the form of, spoilers for Lord of the Rings, in the form of taking care of the biggest baddie among the Nazgul, right? I mean, she does have an interesting arc, I think.
And like a lot of these things, it was obviously we have that whole thing from Macbeth. No man born shall be able to defeat me. I can't remember the line from Macbeth. And obviously Tolkien plays with that, and it's no man born. Yeah, it's a woman that Éowyn fulfills that role because she is no man. But what's interesting, I think, about Éowyn is, again, Faramir proves his worth and gains a wife. Now, we could look at it as Éowyn proves her worth and gains a husband, that there's that sort of balancing of the two roles. But they are really ancillary to the main narrative thrust of Lord of the Rings, the return of the king being Aragorn, the whole conflict with the ring being resolved by Smeagol. Well, actually, it's resolved by Gollum.
True. Yeah, very true. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
I would say, so that's one aspect in the Lord of the Rings, but I think Robin Hobb's Live Ship Traders is actually a brilliant example of not only sort of the idea of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, the 3 generations of the Vestrit family, the female line in the Vestrit family,
Yeah.
but we see a lot of that being explored through the rather bratty, is it Marta? And
Yes. Yes.
and the slightly more grown up, but you know, a wee bit privileged Althea.
Yeah.
And Althea, she goes on her own quest. She has her own goals. She has a whole hero's journey of her own arc. We see
Right.
that contrasted almost with Malta, who
Malta. Yeah.
who is being framed very much as the spoiled brat, who basically has been dowried off, sold off uh, for a political marriage, and
Yeah.
how that evolves as a different, more psychological story rather than the swashbuckling adventures of Althea.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that both Malta and Althea are variants of the Maiden in terms of their arcs, and that you do have Malta's mother. Sorry, I forget her name, but she's a less interesting character for the most part. But she is a sort of motherly character, and then you have the grandmother, who's I love that character. I mean, she is the best of the Vestrits in some ways. But yeah, so I would say that both Malta and Althea play that role of maiden, and in different ways, I think, come into their own. They are definitely more empowered than the traditional maiden figure, for sure. As is Eowyn, I would say, too, because Eowyn is interestingly based on the Old Norse shield maiden, right? There are lots of stories of these shield maidens. That was a thing among the Germanic peoples, was that women could be warriors, and so that was something that
And
Tolkien.
amongst the Celtic tribal histories as well.
Yeah.
Women quite often were part of the war band until people realized if all the women, if a whole lot of the women die, then we can't repopulate the war band because there aren't any women left. And that was the sort of the transition away from having female warriors.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was also Christianity was an influence that ended that as well. But yeah, that's there's a whole history there. So I agree, though, that Liveship Traders is a rich one for this particular archetype of the maiden, and I love the variations that we get. We're not going to give spoilers here for where these two end up, Malta and Althea, but they most certainly have, I think, rich arcs that are thoroughly explored, and they do show their own strength in the course of those arcs as well. Another one, I think, that speaking of strong women, Vin. How about Vin from Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy? She is a maiden figure who certainly comes into some power, right?
Yeah, and now obviously again we don't want to go into the spoilers for the whole trilogy, but thinking just of how she's basically introduced in the first book, a young female character with this power that she's always possessed but never known about, never had the opportunity to exercise. And unlike a lot of the coming of age narratives where it's about you're going to learn to access power, it's she has access to it, she just never had the material access because of how that magic system is constructed. So it's about her getting to exercise the power that she's already possessed, which is an interesting spin on the hero's journey that we traditionally see from the more male aspect. She has this power already. Whereas if you think of like Harry Potter and this sort of thing, it's about them learning the spells. She doesn't need to learn the spells. She needs to practice the thing to get better at it. She already has the power, which it's just it's an interesting and slightly subtle spin on it.
It is indeed. I think an even bigger spin would be Rin, which rhymes with Vin, but slightly different character. Rin from the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. I think she's a great modern take on this archetype of the maiden. And she most certainly takes things in her very own direction. And R.F. Kuang takes that arc into some fairly dark places, frankly. Again, no spoilers here, but she's a character who is the heart of that trilogy. And at the same time, R.F. Kuang doesn't pull punches when it comes to the atrocities committed and what happens to an individual who is exposed to so much trauma. And one common response to trauma is to inflict trauma oneself. And it's a really fascinating arc. I think one of the more empowering arcs when it comes to the maiden that I've come across in modern fantasy. So that's definitely a good one.
And there's an interesting pairing of the Virgin Horde dichotomy in Edding's Belgariad and Malorian, which ties into
Okay.
this sort of moral aspect to it. You have the character of Zenidra, who is a princess. Quite literally, she is a princess, an imperial
Uh-huh.
princess, and she has the red hair, the cute freckles, and is intended to be the love interest of the male hero.
Huh.
And uh, she's contrasted with a lot of the other female characters in the series. So Selmisra, the priestess of one of the gods and the head of state of one of the countries, is a sexually promiscuous high priestess. And she's
Hmm.
fed these drugs and things that hypercharge her libido. And she has these slaves basically to have sex with. And she tries to seduce Garion and drug him. So she's seen as very, very evil, this sexually permissive female character. Whereas Zenidra is very much the virginal girl,
Hmm.
even though she's a real scrapper with a fiery temper to match her red hair. I'm
Oh
not
dear.
saying that Edding's writing was in any way great, but he plays into this. But one of the interesting characters later on is the character of Bethra, and the character that we meet in the sequel quintet, who was she wasn't Silk is the hero, the male character. Velvet, again,
Okay.
original naming sequence. So Bethra was a spy in one of the cities who
Hmm.
had lots of outrageous affairs and is ends up being murdered.
Oh.
Uh, and she's an incidental character, a side character, and one of the heroes' quest group is a bit annoyed at this and goes on a killing spree to avenge her. Because even though she was a spy and morally ambiguous and had tried to assassinate and had assassinated various people, she is clearly a morally complicated character. And that's
Hmm.
why she was allowed to have sex with other people.
Interesting.
Velvet in the sequel is again a spy, an assassin, a morally grey character, and she is sexually permissive.
Uh-huh.
And it's fascinating that this sort of moral complexity comes into it. That the hero and the truly heroic characters must marry, and they must marry a virgin.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas the morally grey, morally ambiguous, or evil characters are the ones that engage in premarital sex.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. R.F. Kuang sort of knocks the whole sexuality part of this out of the picture in an interesting way. I won't, no spoilers for that, but she does something interesting there. Another, for me, fascinating, I think, handling of this archetype is in the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, where you do have these characters who, in some respects, really fit into these categories. You have Demaya, the young girl. You have Cyanite, who is in some ways maiden-like, and you have Esun, who is a mother figure. And then later on, of course, you have her daughter as well, Nasun, who fits more along the maiden, I think, archetype as well. Very interesting what she does in that trilogy with, I think, these roles, and also, like Poppy War, I would say that it's a much more empowering perspective on the maiden and these other female roles, that a good spin on them that I highly recommend it.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting developments that we've seen in a lot of fantasy writing is the movement away from female characters being appendages for or rewards for the male hero. That because we're seeing more complex groups, more complex stories, it's not just the hero's journey. It could be a group of heroes, male and female heroes. It could be a female hero as the central protagonist. That this is now much more commonplace and accepted, and it's not viewed as kicking down boundaries anymore. It is viewed as perfectly normal and acceptable as part of the tradition. And I
Yeah.
think we don't have to look that far back when having a central female protagonist, having a female story was seen as, in some ways, revolutionary. Look at the change that we had in Earthsea, moving from the Wizard of Earthsea storyline
Yeah.
into a much more gynocentric story.
Yes. In the Tombs of Atuan, you have Tenar, who is the virginal priestess figure, maiden figure, essentially. And it's a really interesting story about, how what she does decide to do with that role. And I think a very empowering one. That's going back to 1970. So you had people playing with these, I think, these archetypes even back then, like people like Ursula Le Guin, or in the fourth book in the Earthsea series, Tehanu, the title character, Tehanu, is an embodiment in some respects of the Maiden, but wow, what a very different take on this, and takes the sexuality thing just completely out of the picture, and gives us a much richer, I think, story of a young woman for her own sake and for her own journey, which takes some very interesting turns and reveals some fascinating things about the whole Earthsea world. So yeah, she was doing it way back in the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, but remember, back in the set, this was viewed as, revolutionary, as doing something different. Whereas now, when we see a fantasy story that has at its heart a central female protagonist, we're like, yeah, okay, what's going to happen? We don't go, oh wow, this author is being so daring. And that is just such a wonderful change in the genre, that it has gone from being the exception to now being part of what we read and what we celebrate. I mean, look at the transition from the Stephen King story Carrie, where the idea of womanhood is the transition from childhood to womanhood is made into monster, the monstrous other. That female sexuality was literally turned into a monster for that story. And when you think of that, when you think of female mature sexuality as being literalized into a monster, think of the number of texts that do that as a sort of moral judgment on it. And those actually, if people were going to comment, that those were so commonplace. Whereas now, if we saw someone being judged in that way, it feels very old fashioned. And it's very jarring to our current sensibilities.
Agreed.
But that was not that long ago that Carrie was mainstream.
Yeah. What would you say about Myra of the Acoma? Where would she fit in all this?
I think Mara of the Acoma is, I think, a fantastic example of this, because you literally have the virginal priestess, and then she becomes the ruler of her house. And through the course of the series, political marriages, motherhood, all of these different aspects of one female story being explored, but it is very much an epic fantasy narrative. And Johnny Wirtz and Raymond E. Feist, I think, did a fantastic job with this. And between, like, say, the Daughter of the Empire trilogy that Mara is in, and Robin Hobb's characters in the Live Ship Traders, you can see how epic fantasy can have at their heart of these complex narratives, these psychologically engaging narratives, that it doesn't matter for reader enjoyment whether it is a male or a female character at the center. What matters is that it's a story well told, a book that is well written, a narrative that is well crafted.
Right. Speaking of modern fantasy with rich characters that often challenge tropes and archetypes, let's take a peek at Stephen Erickson's Gardens of the Moon, where you have several variations of the Maiden. You have Sari.
Well, hang on, before we start on this, spoilers, everyone. It's my channel. We're going to talk about Gardens of the Moon, and you know what? It'll be, we're going to talk about it in slightly more depth than normal. So if you haven't read Gardens of the Moon, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you in the next one. For everyone else, I'm assuming you've read Gardens of the Moon, and that's why you're on my channel.
Fair enough, I would say. So you do have Sari, you have Lorne, you have even Chalice, I think is introduced as this in a very interesting way. And if you're just looking at it superficially, you might even see Chalice as a fairly typical representation of the Maiden. But I think if you look a little bit deeper, you're going to see something else, even in Gardens of the Moon. If we're just talking Gardens of the Moon, Chalice is initially introduced as a prize, right? She is Crocus's dream. He's pining for this divine princess-like young lady.
And not only that,
And
her name is Chalice. She is a precious treasure. She is an
yeah,
object that
yeah,
is going to be the cup to be drunk from. Like
yeah,
she is literally named that's the sort of symbol being attached to her. And
right.
what does she do at the end? This hero's journey that Crocus is on, that he's going to go on this thing, and his reward at the end is going to be the beautiful young maiden who will fall madly in love with him. And what does Chalice do? She tells him to basically bugger off
Yeah.
because
Who are
she
you? Yeah.
she has her own story. She is not an object for the male hero. She is not a bit part in his story. She has her own story. It's just not part of Gardens of the Moon. We don't get to read it, but it exists. It's there. And Crocus was actually delusional, thinking that he was the center of the universe, he was the center of the narrative, and the way that these things work out, when you win the quest, you win the girl, and that isn't what happens, because people are not objects to be owned and won.
Well, poor guy, he bought into the hero's journey narrative, and he got a dose of reality. But I think that you have even more, I think, fleshed out characters in Sorry and in Lorne, particularly, as I guess variations. You could see them that way anyway of the Maiden. Lorne as a very tragic example of the Maiden, who in some ways, she has empowered herself by being the adjunct. This is a role that comes with great responsibility and power. So she is empowered in that sense, but at the same time, she is the adjunct. She is expected to fulfill the will of Lessine, and she is, I think, facing a moral dilemma of a sort, whether or not to just be that cog in the wheel that does what it's told to do, or to embrace humanity. And that's the decision, I think, that poor Lorne is faced with, is humanity versus being that, fulfilling that role that she's in, that bureaucratic role, imperial role. So her arc is, I think, a fairly good one though, and fleshed out, right?
And Lorne, again, like, Lorne is actually a relatively young woman, but she
Yeah.
doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have a wife, she doesn't have kids, she
Right.
doesn't have family, she doesn't have parents. She's very much on her own.
Right.
And we see that she's torn between, if we could probably phrase it, the idea of having a life with friends and a personal life, and this love of other people around her, and
Right.
the human aspect, or her job, her career. Is she going to be this political animal, the will of the empire, the will of Lessine? And we see that sort of dilemma that she faces, and she chooses to sacrifice herself to become the role. And I think that's a fascinating look at an aspect of this sort of story of the maiden, of an empowered character, of someone who is making these decisions. We might disagree with them. We might think she made the wrong decision, but
Yeah.
she makes this decision. And we can contrast that with, again, let's look at Lessine, who is only referred to in Gardens of the Moon. But Lessine, again, an incredibly physically as well as politically powerful female character.
Right.
But she's not a magic user.
Right.
And unlike a lot of the other powerful magic users, she's not a magic user. But we know that she trained assassins. We know that she has that martial ability. But again, she sacrifices everything to
Yeah.
be this childless, familyless, friendless leader. And it is, and she's only ever referred to, she's seen so distantly through all of this, people trying to interpret her. And we don't get that deep insight into her as a character, but she is a fascinating aspect of an empowered female character
Yeah.
who, the while other characters may try to judge her, the narrative itself is not judging Lessine, and
Right.
there's not that moral judgment being made about her. And then
Interesting.
we can contrast that with the character of Sorry.
Right, right, indeed. It occurs to me that if if Gardens of the Moon had been written 50 years ago, 99 times out of 100, Lorne and Lessine would have been male characters. And it's probably a good thing that I consider this something of a revelation right now, that it just occurred to me that that would have been the case. I mean, that's the world that Erikson and Esselmont have set up for us, where we don't blink at the fact that the Empress is a woman and that Lorne is a woman, and that we get these rich characters with these arcs that 50 years ago would have been automatically assigned to male characters.
And I think that's an incredibly valid point, because we sometimes forget, because we are locked into our moment, our era, our epoch, we forget that life A has not always been like this.
Right.
And that B, it wasn't so long ago that it wasn't like this.
Right.
And trying sometimes when we look at older works of fiction to remember that they were not written in the time period in which we currently are. They were not written when the prevailing worldviews were not those of today. And that's when we talk about some books, we sometimes will point out like aspects of it have not aged well. And that doesn't mean that they are badly written. It just means that quite often from a cultural standpoint, or some aspect of the narrative, that moving into the modern day, we can see it reflective of attitudes that are no longer prevalent. And we take that into account. It doesn't mean that they are bad books. They were, and when we say it was a product of its time, it is not to excuse that behavior in a cultural sense, but to recognize that it belonged in a different culture.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do we want to say anything else about Sari? Because we did bring her up, but she's, of course, another example.
And this, again, I think is one of the interesting aspects of Erikson's work. Firstly, there are a number of characters in Erikson's world, male and female, who engage in premarital sex or who engage in extramarital sex. And there isn't a judgment weighed on that in the same way that we see in a lot of other fantasy narratives, in which it is much more puritanical, that there's a judgment in the narrative that characters that do that are in some way not good, not pure, not. Whereas in the Malazan world, it's, well, they thought they were going to die. They're in the middle of a war. And you know what? Who cares? They're not hurting anyone. That there isn't a moral judgment associated with it. There was none of this, you have to wait until you are married. And that is, I think, quite interesting, because in a lot of respects, fantasy was, and in some respects still is, quite a conservative genre, particularly in the moral sense, because of its preoccupation with morality in terms of good and evil as a binary. Whereas we have seen with a lot of postmodern fantasy and a lot of modern fantasy now, that it is not a binary anymore. It is a spectrum across aspects of someone's life. And of course, that's a very important point, I think, for us in the modern day. Just because one aspect of someone's life is something we disagree with does not necessarily make them evil. That bit we can disagree with, that bit we can think is a very bad call on their part. But the rest of what they do can still be acknowledged as being good. That it's an interesting aspect that we sometimes get forced into thinking in binaries when we should be thinking much more on terms of a spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Sari is the example of that. She is a serial killer. She is an assassin. She is frightening to the other characters. She tortures other characters, admittedly off page. But she is also a very young girl. And the reason it is all the more stark to these characters is that a lot of these male characters, when they look at her, see a young girl, and they can't separate themselves from a young girl should not be that cruel. But as we see through the course of the series, there are reasons for it. And we see that investigated in a lot of nuanced ways across the entirety of the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Yeah. Her arc becomes very interesting to me. One of the most interesting in the series, actually. But no spoilers for that. We're only spoiling Gardens of the Moon today. So.
But I think the Maiden as a character often represented innocence, that childhood, the perfect innocence before life becomes too complex, before they get corrupted by various other influences. That's quite often what we see with the Maiden. And I think in modern variants of a lot of storytelling and a lot of narratives, including in fantasy, we see a rejection of that as a sort of classification for what a maiden is. And we see it much more now as a young person. And we're not folding them into this idealized notion of moral purity being the thing that describes innocence, that
Right.
innocence can be defined in other ways. And I think that is a very interesting aspect of the maiden as it's now sort of being promulgated through the genre.
Yeah, and I think that is in part probably a realization that we are moving away from a patriarchal culture in which female sexuality is carefully controlled. And so what we're seeing now in a lot of fantasy is a reflection that we've moved beyond that, I think. And I hope that will continue. So any other examples, or do you think we've covered this one pretty well?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of that aspect very well. But to return just very briefly to, again, this idea of the virgin whore dichotomy. And
Yeah.
it isn't something that is as prevalent anymore. But if you cast your mind back to a lot of uh, early 20th century texts and mid 20th century texts, you will see without any difficulty female characters who are sexually permissive, and they will be either evil, they will be seductresses, they will be damaged goods in some form or another, and they are quite often contrasted with the heroine. And the heroine is usually the virginal, the pure, the innocent, the beautiful, the unsullied. And this is this is something that is, it was so pervasive that it is very hard to sort of stamp it all out. And even in the modern day, you will see echoes of it and aspects of it in
Sure.
a lot of fantasy writing, particularly in fantasy, because again, like fantasy is, despite its opportunities, quite often is a conservative genre, and that, you know, it's what we like, it's what we feel comfortable with, it's why we keep returning to it.
We like our tropes in fantasy.
We like our tropes, and there is again this desire for binaries are simple, binaries are straightforward, binaries are very easy to process. And
Right.
think of the number of fantasy stories where you will have basically a dark mirror of a character show up as an antagonist of some kind.
Yeah.
Male, female, it doesn't matter. But think of the number of times that occurs, because we like to have two sides, a good side and a bad side. And
Yeah.
that's what we see being applied to a lot of the maiden tropes, is that they get divided into good maidens and bad. And what's the opposite of a good maiden? It would be a bad woman.
A
And
naughty woman. Yes.
the
Yes.
naughty woman. But it's just to say that this is an aspect, and it continues today, but we are seeing much more complex writing. And it's not a simplistic notion of strong female character. That, you know, this is about giving nuance to characters,
Yeah.
about fully realized, fully rounded, well developed female characters that are part of their own narrative and are not ancillary or aspects of a male narrative. And you know, we talked about this in relation to one of the things that happened in one of the Erickson books, where I had said a character did something and a female character was being used as the spur to action for the male character, and it's uncharacteristic of Erickson's writing. And a lot of people were complaining, saying, no, but it was psychologically real. And you go, yes, it is psychologically real for a male character to act that way. But what it did was it reduced the female character to being a mere appendage on the male character's story.
Right.
And that does not generally happen in Erickson's work.
True. Yeah. The term you used was fridging, I believe. Yeah.
Well, it was a variant on fridging, but that's one way of describing the modern trope. But
Yeah.
do you have anything further to add? Because I think we've covered a lot of different aspects here. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, as always, I don't think we need to throw out more examples. Instead, probably we should be asking your viewers to leave some of their favorite examples of the Maiden and variations on that trope or archetype or whatever you want to call it, but subversions of it perhaps, or inversions as well. I mean, I'm sure there's a ton. I'm thinking in my head that there's probably a lot of romantic fantasy that I don't even know about, where this trope comes up a lot, I would guess.
Well, obviously one of the major precursors to urban fantasy was paranormal romance, and it's still a very popular subgenre. And in fact,
Yeah.
that's basically, I think I'm writing this. I think that's basically where a lot of urban fantasy came from, because initially it was a lot of paranormal romance. It was perceived as a very female genre,
Huh.
subgenre, and then the urban fantasy was meant to be the sort of the male spin-off. But I don't fully agree with that, but that's dark fantasy. It was called in the early 90s, and then it became paranormal romance because it focused on that
Okay.
aspect. But it wasn't new then. This has been going on for years. Think of Dracula. Um,
Right.
Mina Harker, so Wilhelmina Harker, or Wilhelmina Murray, as she was to her own name, to use an expression from here,
Yeah.
um, and Lucy Westenra. And Lucy Westenra, the loose Westerner, who has three separate men
Oh,
basically calling on her and then share their blood with her, their bodily fluids in an intimate, penetrating manner through the blood transfusion.
well,
Then
that's subtle.
Dracula penetrates her as well, and she becomes a vampire. She
Huh.
becomes evil.
Right.
Then uh, Mina, the perfect virgin who marries Jonathan and is then savagely attacked by Dracula, doesn't invite him in, but is attacked by Dracula. She's the victim. Lucy, on the other hand, was a loose Westerner.
Oh dear. Yeah.
A lot of this has been going on for a long time. But I
Interesting.
think, yeah, there are so many aspects
Right.
of representations of maiden and maidenhood and this sort of thing that we see in fantasy and horror and science fiction. But
All over. Yeah.
why don't we call it here? So thank you very much, Philip. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, AP. Thank you so much. And thanks to the viewers as well for watching.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next one.